The aesthetics and style of mid-century furniture has stood the test of time. In fact, it's enjoying a bit of a resurgence of late. As someone who was born in 1955, I'm hoping some of that mid-century popularity is going to rub off on me. This walnut console with sliding tambour doors may look like it was born about the same time I was, but in fact, we just got done building it. And it might look complicated to you, but I think it's well within the scope of almost any home shop woodworker. Let me show you how we went about building it. In this case, we started out with rough sawn walnut. We surfaced two sides flat and parallel to each other at a 1-inch thickness. And then we jointed each edge so they were 90 degrees to the faces and perfectly straight so that we could later glue and clamp them together. Before you begin any butt joint, what you need to do is compose the panel. And what I mean by that is look at your wood and find out the most attractive ways to put it together. So in this case, I've got two gray boards that are kind of grayer colored and one that has more purple highlights. I put the gray boards on the outside and the purple one in the middle, and I think that's going to be great. The next thing I need to do is to figure out how the various panels that we need will be harvested out of this piece. Now we're going to use waterfall construction, which means that the grain is going to flow up one side, across the top panel, and down the other side. I need at least 20 inches for the downside panel, and I've got that, and that's what this mark here is for. Now we need a 44-inch center panel, and I've got that here. Now, one cool thing, a great tip is that if you're working in walnut, regular pencil marks don't show so well. So you can use chalk, or in this case, I'm going to use a chalk marker. How cool is that? And you can really see that on your panel. Now I've got the second mark made. Now the next thing I'm going to do is an old trick. It's just called a carpenter's triangle, which is just a way to realign these boards after they've been separated. I'll always be able to put them in the proper sequence when I'm taking them apart to do some machining. The last bit of marking I did at this point was mark locations where I can cut slots for biscuit joints. So why would I need biscuit joints on this? It doesn't add any strength. What it does is it helps me align these boards as I'm gluing them up. So you can see this one's got a little bit of a crown. This one goes down the opposite direction. So with this kind of a long butt joint, biscuits are a really helpful thing in doing the glue up. Now I'm going to pop this clamp off, and I'm going to get ready to cut some biscuit slots. The last step before applying glue and clamping it up for a final assembly is to do a dry assembly like I've done here with the biscuits in place, clamps on the surface. It's really difficult to reverse a glue up, so it's an important step to take. For an indoor furniture piece like this one, Titebond Original is the perfect formula. These joints will still be solid in 100 years. To get a proper glue joint, you need to apply a thin coat of glue to both joining edges. To help keep the panel flat, I position clamps on both faces of the glue up. In a large glue up like this one, I prefer the glue to cure for several hours. But to make my life easier, I scrape off the squeeze out when the glue gets rubbery. So that covers the basics of using a butt joint to create a large panel. It's one of the most important joints in woodworking. So we've created our glued up panel to cut the waterfall joints out of. I'm going to cut a side, the top, and then another side so that the grain can flow right through it. Now, you might notice this really large crosscut sled. The reason why I'm using that is it helps make the cuts more controllable. In addition to the sled, I have a hold down cleat here, which holds the board tightly to the surface. I have a hold down clamp here, does the same thing on this edge, and then I have another cleat that holds it tight to the fence. All of those things take those problems out of consideration for me, so I can just concentrate on making a good cut. One feature of this crosscut sled is that it has a saw curve that indicates where the saw blade actually cuts. So I mark the length of the panel and then slide that mark right up to the curve. Last thing I do before I cut is to make some marks on the panel so that I can easily reassemble the panel in the order they were cut. Another way to make this cut more controllable is to wax the bottom of the jig so it slides easily across the tabletop. Now with the pieces all cut up square, I've got my two sides and my top. I'm going to now lean the blade over to 45 degrees. Then I'm going to raise it up through the jig. Then I'm going to make a complete cut cycle so that I have the clear curve here and a registration mark for my 45-degree angle. Should work perfectly. There's a lot of ways to glue together miter joints, but some of them lose their functionality as you start getting bigger and bigger projects like this console. So in this case, I'm going to glue my clamping cauls right to the walnut, but I'm going to take advantage of the characteristics of this hide glue, which is both brittle and water soluble. So I'm going to glue the cauls down. We'll clamp the case together, square across using those cauls, and then afterwards, I'll take a hammer and a chisel, break it loose, use some hot water and a scratchy pad, clean it all off, raise all the grain, and then we're ready to go. I put on a single wiggly bead of hide glue. I don't put on too much because otherwise the caul will be harder to remove later on. One of the challenges about gluing together a miter joint is sometimes that joint wants to slip, especially when you have glue on it. So, in order to prevent that, we're going to use biscuits on this miter joint. I'm going to do 3 of them, one registered off of each side and then one dead in the middle, and it'll allow me to glue it up perfectly. With any furniture project, dry assembly is a really important step. You need to test it out because let me tell you, glue up is hard to reverse. And speaking of glue, I'm going to be using Titebond 3 in this case because it gives me a little bit longer open time, and this is a big project. It'll make that easier. When I've got it clamped up like this in a dry assembly, the next thing I need to do is measure from corner to corner. Why am I doing that? To see if this carcass is square. If the measurements are not exact, then I can take a clamp and squeeze one way or the other and square it up because that's important. As with nearly any glue joint, the way to success is to have a thin, uniform coat of glue on both surfaces. You might want to cheat, only put it on one side. You're going to regret that decision. This is how you get a perfectly solid glue joint. In this case, I'm not gluing the biscuits. They're simply for alignment purposes. There'll be some glue that joins them, but it's not essential to this operation. They are essential to me getting the joint perfectly aligned, however. You can see why the longer open time of Titebond 3 is a big advantage here. You can see that this is essentially end grain. It's not 100% end grain, but that's one of the reasons why it's so important to get a good coat of glue on both faces. Now, with this last clamp, this end of the cabinet is glued up. I'm going to move to the other end and do exactly the same thing, and then it'll be ready to go. So this is it, the last clamp. Joint fits together tightly. Going to measure for square. That looks great. Once the glue is cured, we'll come back, take the clamps off, and then we'll break off these clamping cauls, which I have to say have made this task a lot easier. Now we have to get these clamping cauls off of the carcass. Now remember that we used hide glue, which we're counting on its brittle nature to fracture before the fibers of the wood pull up. Oftentimes what actually happens is that the plywood will fracture, and you'll leave behind some pieces of veneer. When that happens, you just sand it smooth, but you're not done then. You still have to come behind with hot water and a scratchy pad to dissolve any of the hide glue that has seeped into the wood fibers. Then you go through your sanding, staining, everything's good. So, to get started, you want to hold the chisel flat to the carcass, and what you're really counting on is this wedge shape that will force the plywood up and fracture the glue. Start near the end and give it some wax. So here's the results. We scrubbed away any excess hide glue with hot water and a scratchy. We sanded it smooth, and now you can see how well this grain flows right around the corner, really demonstrating it well. We're building a Tambour door console cabinet, and these grooves need to match up identically to the grooves on the top. And in addition, we have 3 DADOES for vertical dividers in this cabinet. So, how do we go about making all of those things match up exactly? So now we've got the top of the cabinet on the bench. This will be the front. And I'm going to use the same template that we used to route the Tambour groove on the bottom, but something you should know is that I had this face up when I was routing the bottom, and now I'm going to have this face up when I'm routing the top. The reason for that, if there's anything not perfectly symmetrical about this jig, it will make sure that they still align with one another. Now, I'm going to register this thing 1 inch in, 1 inch in all the way around. Then I'm actually going to screw it to the top because we won't ever see those holes. So the Tambour groove is cut with a 5/16 inch straight bit that's mounted in a plunge router. I also installed a router guide bushing which follows the end of the template, ensuring an accurate cut. Now that we've formed the Tambour grooves in the top, I have 3 more DADOES to route. They're for the vertical dividers that go inside the cabinet. I'm going to use a router with a 3/4 inch diameter straight bit, and I'm going to make those grooves in 2 passes. One additional detail is that we routed a slight mortise within the divider dado in order to accommodate the T-nut that connects the leg. One of the challenges that occurred after we cut this dado in for the upright divider is that it changed the shape of the tambour track, and the tambour caught on the back corner. So we created these plugs. They restore the shape of the track so the tambour will travel smoothly, but don't install these until the final assembly. Before we go any further in the construction of this console, I want to talk about a few of the interior details. First of all, there's 3 internal dividers, and you can see we've already routed the grooves for that, or the dados. It's 3/4 inch plywood, and we glued a hardwood face on the forward edge of that to protect the edge. Additionally, we'll drill some shelf pin holes inside of that so that we can have a couple of shelves floating in here. After they're mounted inside, we'll put a 1/4 inch piece of plywood and it'll seal it up. Finally, we have these interior cabinet styles. They look really nice, but they have a practical purpose as well in that they hide this return space between the cabinet side and the tambour. You'll notice that we beveled the back face of these styles in order to accommodate the shape of the track and allow clearance for the tambour. I'm going to glue these legs up in 4 courses of 3 pieces of walnut. I'm using Type Bond 3 here because it has a longer open time. Now the reason why that's important is I've got 3 other sets of legs that I need to make to glue up and get ready before I can put the clamps on. Now I need to get a nice smooth coat of glue, which is why I use this spreader. Once I get this spread out, I'm going to put the course together like this. Kind of squeeze it a little bit to get a tack going. Now I'll move on to the next one. You might notice that there's a big ugly knot there. That's okay because this leg is going to taper from its full dimension here down to almost 1 inch around. So all of that wood will be turned away and it'll look great. So now I'm going to glue up this last leg and put them in the clamps. Now I've got glue on all 4 sets of legs, and now I'm using clamps to clamp them all up at one time. Flip this over. Now, put the last set on the other side of the block, and then let the glue cure for several hours. Now that the legs are glued up and out of the clamps, I've cut them square to length, and I've drilled a hole for this threaded insert. This threaded insert will be useful in 2 ways. First of all, it'll help me mount it on the lathe, where I'll turn this to a perfectly tapered leg. Second of all, it will help as I mount it to the cabinet, and I'll be able to bolt the leg to the cabinet. I'm going to use this Instant Bond glue to help secure it in there, and then get to turning. Got the leg blank mounted on the lathe now. The goal here is to turn a taper that starts at 2 7/8 of an inch and goes all the way down to 1 inch. And we want 4 legs that look identical. It'd be great if they were identical, but really look identical is where I'm going to aim for. So how do I make sure I get that proper taper? This little jig will help me. I'll show you how I use it in a minute, but I'm going to be able to get the 2 7/8 inch diameter up here, the 1 inch diameter down here, and then I'm going to connect the dots. Pretty simple, really. Good. Now that I've got this diameter established and this one, Now I'm going to take my spindle roughing out tool and just create a straight taper between the two. Just think of it as connecting the dots. All right, got it roughly to size, scraped it off smooth. Now some sanding, get ready for the final finish. 3 more legs to go. The next step on the leg process is that we want the legs to be mounted to the console at a slight angle. Now to do that, we're going to drill a mortise for them at a slight angle using this jig to establish that angle. Now you'll notice that we have a 2 7/8 inch Forstner bit here, which is exactly the size, the diameter that we turn this leg to. So I've tested this on a piece of scrap plywood. I know that the location is right, the angle is right, and if you'll notice there's a hole in the center of the mortise, a divot, and we'll be able to drill through that for the bolt that will hold this thing on later. Let's get started on the real product. Using the same jig, I'm drilling a hole through the board for the bolt that will later attach the leg. So now you can see how the angled mortise allows the legs to seat properly for this cabinet. So I'm going to bolt this leg on using this threaded insert later on, but we're also going to use a glue. The glue joint is best made, especially when you're talking about face grain to end grain, with hide glue. It's an old luthier's trick. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to apply the glue to the end of this leg, wipe it off, allow it to dry, and then we'll bolt and glue it in place later. Now I'm going to allow this glue to dry, and as it's drying, I'm going to go and assemble the carcass. Later on, I'll put the bolt through here, we'll apply some more fresh hide glue in the mortise, put the leg in place, screw it down, and that joint will be solid for years and years to come. This is a Tambour panel. What is a Tambour panel? It's a flexible panel made from individual slats that are actually called tambours. Now they're not that hard to make, especially if you use a router set like the one from Rockler Woodworking Hardware. And the cool thing about this set is that it allows you to interlock these individual pieces so that they can't warp or go wonky on you. After you've assembled all of these things together, then you glue them to a piece of canvas, which allows you to have a very flexible panel, which can be used as a cabinet door or like in a roll-top desk. Like I said, they're not hard to do. Let me show you how we machine these pieces. Feed the prepared stock through the first router bit, routing the full depth of cut with one pass. We recommend feather boards to hold the stock securely as you cut. This bit set comes with complete and easy to follow instructions. The only deviations from the instructions we made was to machine long strips of walnut and then cut them to length later. The second profile cut is made in the same manner as the first. The last piece of machining that we need to do is to cut a little rabbet out of the face of the tambour. Tambour panels follow a track or a groove that we routed into the casework, and we cut out a little rabbet in the face so that it fits accurately in that groove. We cut it out of the face because then it hides the groove. To make the cut, we set up the table saw with a dado head. We've raised that up so it's cutting the exact correct depth, and we've got a little carriage here that we've mounted to the miter gauge that allows us to cut this accurately. We've got a stop here, and it allows us to make a super accurate and very controllable cut. Now the next step in making a tambour panel is to make a jig that will hold your slats tightly together and keep them square, because if you glue them up and they're not square, they won't slide properly in the track. I like to look at the face of the panel. This will be forward facing, the front of it, so I can align and compose the panel in terms of grain pattern. Once I've got that where I like it, the next thing to do is I have to turn them all over. I'm going to flip them end for end here and get busy. Now that I've got all the slats flipped over, I'm going to attach the last piece of the jig, making sure that everything's tight and square. And then I'm going to move on to masking off the panel. Masking tape will keep the glue from where we don't want it. It will also control where the canvas sticks. And after we're done and the canvas is glued in place, we can then just flip up the tape and cut the canvas with a razor blade. It's really pretty slick. Now the fun part. We get to finally apply the canvas to the tambour door. I get all the dust out of there. Once again, we're using hide glue. I bet you've never used this much hide glue in your life. But I'm going to roll it on to the canvas. As you can see, it takes a lot of glue to saturate this canvas. And we need this canvas to stick to our slats. So don't be conservative with it. Now the cool thing about the hide glue is that if something ever goes wrong with your tambour panel, you can use hot water and just steam that canvas off of the panel and repair it. It's all good to go. Okay, I think we're getting there. I need a way to control how much hide glue I get onto the wood panel. I don't want to get it too wet because I don't want the glue to go down between the slats and glue the panel together. So I just want a nice wet coat right on the top of the panel. Now to put the canvas onto the tambour panel. I carefully place it down, start to spread it out. Now, as you know, friction causes heat, and in this case, the heat will help the hide glue to bond to the panel. It all works very nicely. Removing the excess canvas is not hard at all. Fold the canvas back right where the masking tape ends. Use a sharp knife and trim away the excess canvas. Now with the canvas attached to the back, you're really going to be able to understand why we form these rabbets on either ends of the tambours. It's going to fit in to this groove right here. Kiln-dried walnut can be kind of gray and bland, even when you put a finish on it. But fortunately, we've got a trick that will pop the color and make it look like old-fashioned air-dried walnut. Let me show you how it's done. Woodworkers Journal finishing expert Michael Dresner turned me onto this trick where you use an orange dye, of all things, to pop the color in walnut. But how much dye do you dissolve into the alcohol to get what the desired effects? That's where testing comes in. This time I'm going to dissolve the dye into alcohol. I could use water if I chose, but I'm going to use alcohol this time, and I put 200 cc's into this container. I'm going to start my first test coloration with a few drops of the orange dye, see how I like it. I can intensify it later if I wish. The reason why I want to be careful about this is I want to be able to replicate the formula. Not exactly, but close enough that an entire project will look the same if I stain it. You really want to wear protective gloves when you're doing this, something that will keep your skin from being discolored, because dye just doesn't go away. It takes a long time to wear off. I'm going to try this, see what I think of the coloration. One important thing to know is that dye will look like it has a finish on it when you make it wet. So that's the color it would be if it was finished. I want more orange. So, 1, 2. Now the cool thing about dye is that if you put one color on and it's not intense enough, you can just go right over the top of it. So that's the formula I want. I'm going to get ready and put it on my bigger project. You can see that there's lots of pieces to get your dye applied to, which is why I thought it would be a great example for how to use aniline dye. I kind of like these staining sponges that have a cloth exterior to it. It allows me to apply stain without it dripping too much, but still get the surface nice and wet. You can see that I'm trying to get into all of these grooves. If there's any excess, and you wipe it off, help spread it around. One of the benefits of dye is that it dries quickly, but also once it is dry and you go back and you see that there's a spot you've missed, you can just touch it right up. It's really nice in that regard. So now I've applied the dye to the entire surface of the door. I've got a nice, uniform, even coloring. It's going to be beautiful when I put my next finish on, which in this case I'm going to apply some shellac and then follow that with wax. But you could put any clear finish over it that you would like. So that's how easy it is to build this project. You know, mid-century style has remained popular because it fits into so many styles and decor. I hope you found this video interesting, and perhaps it's intrigued you enough to try to build this project. I'm Rob Johnstone from Woodworker's Journal. Keep on making sawdust.